The palace gates were not supposed to open this way. They were meant for processions of victory, for brides carried in litters, for ambassadors announcing peace. But on this day, they opened under the shadow of fire. Soldiers poured through like a tide of steel, and the princess, once wrapped in silks and jewels, felt only the iron weight of a stranger's hand pulling her forward. The fall of her father's city had been swift, almost cruelly efficient. Bells that once rang in celebration now tolled as warnings, and the streets where she had been paraded as the daughter of a king were filled with smoke. For the conquerors, the city was treasure. For her, it was a graveyard. Behind her, she could still hear the cries of the loyal few cut down in courtyards, but she had no time to grieve. She was marched past corpses, past smoldering homes, past the church where she had been christened, toward the unknown. This was no random seizure. The Ottomans did not leave such matters to chance. For them, daughters were not merely spoils, they were instruments. The princess was not seen as a captive, but as a resource, a seed to be transplanted. Her body carried her dynasty's legitimacy, her bloodline a currency more valuable than gold. She did not yet understand this, but the men who gripped her arms understood it perfectly. She was not alone. Across Europe, when fortresses fell or treaties were signed, daughters of noble houses vanished into the same silence. Some were taken with violence, dragged through burning halls. Others were handed over by fathers desperate to save thrones, their tears hidden behind signatures on parchment. The methods varied, but the outcome was identical. Once they left their homeland, they ceased to belong to themselves. The hook of their story is not in the capture. That was predictable. Armies win, castles burn. The true horror came later, in what the Ottomans perfected with a patience unmatched by any other empire, a machine that could transform royalty into servants of their enemies. Death might have preserved dignity, but survival meant erasure. On that first night of captivity, the princess clutched memories like fragile glass, the lullabies her nurse once sang, the stone steps where she had played with her brothers, her mother's scent of rose oil. She tried to whisper prayers, but the words felt heavy, as though the air itself denied them. Around her, soldiers murmured in a language she could not understand. That incomprehension, that wall of sound, was her first taste of exile. By dawn, the walls of her father's palace were behind her. Ahead lay the endless road to Constantinople, the city of the conqueror. She did not know it yet, but every step would strip something from her: name, faith, language, blood, and finally even the memory of being who she once was. The fall of her city was not the end of her story. It was the prologue to something far darker. The journey began not with fanfare, but with silence. The princess and the other captives were loaded into carriages covered with heavy drapes, sealing them away from the world. No sunlight, no fresh air, only the swaying darkness and the muffled sound of hooves striking the road. What little food or water they were given tasted foreign, laced with bitter herbs that dulled their senses. This was no accident. It was design. The Ottomans understood that breaking the body was simple. Breaking the mind required something subtler. They were not treated like prisoners of war, nor like honored guests. They were kept in a liminal space, half asleep, half aware, as though their old lives were already dissolving. The disorientation was deliberate. Days and nights blurred until even time itself felt untrustworthy. When the curtains were briefly lifted for air, she would glimpse landscapes she did not recognize. Villages speaking unfamiliar tongues, mountains that seemed sharper and higher than those of her homeland, rivers flowing toward an unknown sea. Each glimpse reminded her she was farther from the world she knew. At night, when the caravan stopped, guards stood watch, not out of fear of escape. There was nowhere to run, but to ensure no one spoke in their mother tongue. Whispers of familiar words were punished with silence, sometimes with blows. Isolation was enforced not just physically, but linguistically. They were being taught that their very voices belonged to another empire now. Occasionally, merchants or peasants on the roadside caught sight of them. To those strangers, the captives were curiosities, glimpses of another world folded into the Ottoman machine. No one intervened, no one dared. The empire's shadow stretched too far, and its message was clear. Resistance was meaningless. For the princess, The most unbearable weight was not chains or hunger. It was helplessness. She had grown up believing herself the embodiment of her people's hopes, a link in a sacred bloodline. Now she was hidden behind curtains, anonymous, reduced to a body carried from place to place. The empire had begun the work of erasure before she even arrived. But there was calculation in this cruelty. The Ottomans did not wish their captives broken outright. Shattered pieces were useless. They wanted pliable clay, malleable but intact. The sedation, the silence, the endless road. These were not punishments but preparation. When they finally reached Constantinople, the captives would no longer feel like daughters of kings or heirs of dynasties. They would feel rootless, uncertain, and ready to cling to whatever structure was offered to them. At last, after what felt like a lifetime on the road, the golden domes of the conqueror's city appeared on the horizon. Constantinople rose out of the earth like a dream-made stone. Massive walls, glittering minarets, palaces spilling light onto the Bosporus. To the weary eyes of the captives, it looked less like a city and more like a sentence carved into the landscape. The carriages entered the city through gates towering higher than any fortress in her homeland. Crowds gathered to watch. For the Ottomans, this procession was not shameful. It was triumph, living proof that empires could consume kingdoms not only with armies, but with bloodlines. The princess pressed her hand to the curtain, straining for one last look at the world beyond. But the guards pulled it shut again. She would not see her homeland's sky anymore. The road to Constantinople was finished. The next road, the one that erased who she was just beginning. The palace was not just a residence, it was a factory of transformation. From the moment the princess was carried across its marble thresholds, she was no longer addressed by her name. The syllables that once carried her family's legacy, whispered with reverence in her homeland, were stripped away. In their place came a new name, softer in some ways, harsher in others. It was not chosen for her, but imposed upon her, a label in the conqueror's tongue. With that single act, her old identity began to dissolve. The first ritual of erasure was physical. Her clothes, once stitched by court seamstresses and perfumed with rose oil, were taken and burned. The garments of her childhood, the fabrics that carried the colors of her house, were reduced to ash in the courtyard fire. In their place, she was dressed in silks that shimmered with Ottoman patterns, beautiful but alien. She did not belong to them. Rather, they claimed her. The fire devoured not just fabric but memory. Her hair, once braided in the style of her mother's court, was undone and rewoven by strangers. She was taught new gestures, new ways to bow, new ways to sit. Even her posture was corrected, as though her very spine carried rebellion that needed straightening. The transformation was not rushed. It was careful, deliberate. The Ottomans understood that sudden force could spark defiance. They sought not to shatter, but to bend. Language was the next chain. Tutors surrounded her, speaking only in Turkish, forbidding her mother tongue. At first she resisted, clinging to the familiar sounds and whispered prayers at night. But silence weighed heavily, and eventually the foreign words seeped into her thoughts. The more she spoke them, the harder it became to recall the rhythm of her old language. What began as obedience became habit, and habit became loss. Religion followed. Chapels that once filled her with comfort were now barred. In their place stood mosques, their call to prayer echoing through the palace courtyards. At first she shut her ears, refusing to kneel. But isolation is a powerful weapon. Each refusal brought greater loneliness, greater punishment, until resistance felt like drowning. The moment she whispered her first prayer in the conqueror's faith, the tutors smiled, not with kindness, but with satisfaction. The machine had turned another cog. The princess was not alone in this. Hundreds of others had walked the same corridors, endured the same rituals, shed their names, their faiths, their voices. Some wept through the process, their tears drying into silence. Others adapted quickly, reshaping themselves as survival demanded. The empire allowed no middle ground. One either transformed or was discarded. By now she could scarcely recognize her reflection. The girl who had once been her father's daughter, bearer of a dynasty's hopes, stared back at her as a stranger. Her gowns were Ottoman, her language Ottoman, her prayers Ottoman. But inside, buried deep, fragments of her old self flickered like dying embers. She clung to them in secret, though each passing day made them harder to keep alive. The palace did not erase people with violence. It erased them with patience. One ritual at a time, one word at a time, one prayer at a time, until even memory bent under the weight of change. The princess had survived the fall of her city, the march across foreign lands, the journey into the heart of the empire. But survival here came at a greater cost. The engine of assimilation had begun its work, and there was no turning back. The true battle for a captive princess did not take place on the battlefield, nor even in the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace. It happened quietly, invisibly, in her heart and mind. The Ottomans had perfected a method not only to break bodies but to claim souls. Conversion was not a single act. It was a carefully staged theater of dominance, designed to turn resistance into obedience and obedience into loyalty. At first, faith became a weapon of torment. The princess was forbidden to pray in her old way, forbidden to hold a cross, forbidden even to whisper the names of saints. The silence was crushing. Guards and tutors watched her closely, punishing even the faintest slip into the faith of her childhood. But the Ottomans understood that punishment alone could not erase devotion. To kill her religion outright would make her a martyr. Instead, they sought to replace it. Conversion began with small steps disguised as kindness. Tutors spoke of mercy, of a God who forgave weakness, of a prophet who cared for orphans and the abandoned. They gave her fine garments, rich food, and even gentle praise, but always tied to moments when she performed Islamic prayers or recited a verse. Faith became entangled with survival until the line between belief and necessity blurred. The most devastating tactic was choice, or rather, the illusion of it. She was never told outright, "You must convert or die." Instead, the tutors framed it as liberation. "You are no longer a prisoner," they whispered. "You are chosen." She could keep resisting, but the price was endless isolation, humiliation, and fear. Or she could surrender, kneel, and feel the weight of punishment lift instantly. Each time she complied, even slightly, she was rewarded with warmth. Her captors reshaped her instincts until she began to long for their approval. For many, the breaking point came during the ceremonial Shahada, the declaration of faith. It was staged before witnesses, often diplomats and foreign envoys, as proof that the empire's power extended not just over cities, but over souls. The princess, veiled in Ottoman silk, stood before the imam and repeated the words. Some spoke them with trembling lips, still clinging to their past faith in secret. Others, exhausted, said them with relief. Their resistance finally dissolved. Either way, once the words left their mouths, their old lives were gone. From that moment, everything changed. Her new name was etched in the palace registers. She was taught new prayers, new rituals, new holidays. She no longer celebrated Easter or Christmas. Those days passed in silence, replaced by Ramadan and Eid. The calendar of her childhood was wiped away, her time measured only by the empire's rhythm. But conversion was never just about religion. It was about loyalty. A Christian princess could never truly belong in the Sultan's household, but a Muslim woman could. By erasing her old faith, the Ottomans ensured that her loyalty, and her children's loyalty, belonged entirely to the empire. What had begun as conquest of land now became conquest of bloodline. Some adapted fully, even eagerly, becoming zealous believers and harsh enforcers of the same system that had broken them. Others complied outwardly while carrying the ashes of their faith in secret prayers whispered at night. Yet whether genuine or false, conversion completed the transformation. The empire no longer held just her body, it held her soul. And with her soul claimed, the next stage of her life in the harem, marriage, motherhood, and political power, would bind her forever to the Ottoman machine. If the capture and conversion were the breaking of a princess's past, then the harem was the machinery that shaped her future. To outsiders, the imperial harem was cloaked in mystery, whispered about as a place of sensuality and forbidden power. But for the young captives brought to Topkapi, it was far more than that. It was a machine of transformation, a social and political labyrinth where every breath, every glance, Every gesture determined survival. The harem was no single chamber, but a sprawling network of halls, courtyards, and guarded apartments. Marble floors polished like mirrors reflected the glow of oil lamps, and high ceilings carried the faint echo of footsteps. Guards stood at every threshold, their silence a reminder that escape was not even a dream worth holding. Here, hundreds of women, captives, slaves, and daughters of noble blood, were woven together into a hierarchy as intricate as any battlefield strategy. At the base of this hierarchy were the newest arrivals, often disoriented, their identities freshly stripped. They were taught the smallest details of Ottoman etiquette, how to walk with measured grace, how to bow their heads, how to serve with silence. Every mistake was corrected with swift severity. If a girl had once laughed freely in her father's castle, here even the tone of her laughter was corrected until it fit the harem's order. Above them stood the seasoned women, those who had long ago surrendered their old lives. Many were themselves once princesses, now remade as tutors and wardens. They trained the newcomers in everything from dance and music to courtly politics. These older women embodied both warning and promise. Submit fully, and one could rise to power. Resist, and one would vanish into obscurity, forgotten even within these walls. At the pinnacle stood the Sultan's favorites, women who had mastered the machinery to such perfection that they became figures of influence in the empire itself. To be chosen by the Sultan was both blessing and curse. A favorite might rise to the rank of Haseki Sultan, mother to princes, her voice whispered into the Sultan's ear during matters of war and diplomacy. But her life was bound entirely to his favor. One shift of mood, one rumor, one misstep, and she could be replaced, her power erased overnight. The harem's greatest secret was not sensuality but politics. Every marriage, every child, every whispered conversation was part of the Ottoman strategy. Captive princesses were rarely left idle. They were married off to generals, viziers, and governors in unions calculated to strengthen the empire. A daughter of a Balkan king might be wed to a commander stationed in her homeland, her children serving as Ottoman heirs to her father's lost throne. The harem was not just a prison, it was a forge producing living weapons of diplomacy. Daily life inside this machine was suffocatingly precise. Women rose at dawn to the sound of prayers, their mornings spent in lessons, embroidery, or rehearsed performances of song and poetry. Meals were taken in silence, watched by guards and tutors. Nights were filled with uncertainty. Who would be summoned? Who would remain in the shadows? Who would be elevated and who would be forgotten? The system thrived on rivalry. Bonds of friendship were discouraged. Competition was constant, and every woman was made to understand that her survival depended on pleasing those above her. A smile could hide betrayal. A gift might carry poison. The walls of the harem echoed with secrets and schemes, and those who navigated them successfully became as dangerous as generals on a battlefield. For the captive princesses, this machinery had one unshakable purpose: to turn them from daughters of Europe into mothers of Ottomans. Every layer of the system was designed to strip away resistance and to bind them to the empire not only through fear but through blood. By the time a princess bore her first child, she no longer belonged to her father's kingdom. She belonged entirely to the Sultan's world. And in this world, motherhood was not a sanctuary. It was the final binding chain, ensuring that her loyalties and her very heart could never return to the lands that had once been hers. The system that consumed the daughters of fallen kings was vast and faceless, but its horrors can be understood most clearly through the lives of those who endured it. Each princess carried with her the echo of a kingdom that no longer existed, her story becoming a living record of conquest, assimilation, and loss. One of the earliest was Princess Catherine of Bosnia, a child when her homeland fell in 1463. Torn from her mother, Queen Catherine, she was carried to Constantinople in secrecy. European envoys begged for her release, but their pleas fell into silence. Years later, a tombstone appeared with an unfamiliar name, marking her as the daughter of a king. Nothing else remained: her Christian faith, her Bosnian heritage, her voice, all erased by the Ottoman machine. Her story is remembered not through chronicles of triumph, but through absence, a reminder of how completely an identity could vanish. Another victim was Maria Palaiologina, daughter of the last Byzantine emperor. She was only 16 when Constantinople fell in 1453. Once destined to continue the empire of her ancestors, she was absorbed into the Sultan's household, renamed, and married to an Ottoman general. Within a decade, she was no longer a symbol of resistance, but a strategist for her captors, offering intelligence that helped extinguish what remained of Byzantine power. The empire she should have inherited was destroyed, and she herself became one of the weapons that destroyed it. Then there was Irene of Trebizond, captured when the Black Sea kingdom crumbled. Converted and renamed Gulbahar Hatun, she gave birth to Prince Selim in 1470. What followed was perhaps the cruelest irony of all. She was required to raise her son not as the heir of her own lineage, but as a conqueror of it. For 15 years, she taught him European courtly customs so that he could use them against her people. Her child would grow into the very instrument that erased her family's legacy. Stories like these were repeated across generations. Hungarian princesses vanished after the Battle of Mohacs. Serbian daughters were recorded in Ottoman registers, like entries in a ledger, and Wallachian noblewomen were listed for cultivation in documents that treated them no differently than livestock. To the empire, their value was not as individuals, but as vessels, bloodlines to be redirected, wombs to produce heirs who would belong entirely to the Sultan. Yet even in their silence, these women shaped history. Many became mothers of powerful Ottoman rulers, their influence seeping into court politics through whispered counsel and maternal authority. Some wielded immense hidden power, yet always within the framework of the system that had enslaved them. Their triumphs were inseparable from their tragedies, for every step they climbed within the palace was built upon the ruins of their former selves. The stories of Catherine, Maria, and Irene are not anomalies. They are threads in a vast tapestry of loss and transformation. Each name represents not just a person, but an entire dynasty swallowed by the empire's hunger. And for every princess whose name survives in records, there were countless others whose identities were erased so completely that history can only guess at their existence. These living testimonies reveal the full cruelty of the Ottoman system. It did not simply end dynasties, it used their daughters to hollow them out from within, ensuring that the blood of fallen kings flowed in the veins of the empire that destroyed them. Centuries have passed since the gates of Constantinople closed behind the wagons of stolen princesses, yet their shadows remain. Their voices were silenced, their names rewritten, but their legacy still lingers, in blood, in memory, and in the uneasy silence of history. Modern genetic studies reveal fragments of their presence. In today's Turkish population, traces of European royal lineages can be identified, woven into the DNA of families who have long forgotten the names of their ancestors. These genetic echoes tell a story the records only hinted at. Thousands of women of royal blood folded into the Ottoman body, their heritage hidden but not erased. A Byzantine princess's eyes, a Hungarian noblewoman's hair, a Serbian daughter's jawline. All survive in faces that walk the streets of Istanbul, though the women themselves have no monuments to honor them. But their legacy was not only genetic, it was political. By forcing these women into assimilation, the Ottomans gained something more powerful than land. They gained legitimacy. Each child born of a captive princess carried a claim, a tether linking the empire to the dynasties it had destroyed. Through these living heirs, the Sultan could argue that he was not just the conqueror of kingdoms, but their rightful heir. Blood became a weapon sharper than any sword, and dynastic politics became another battlefield where the Ottomans triumphed. For Europe, the consequences were devastating. Royal families lived in constant fear of losing their daughters, knowing that their capture would not simply wound the family, it would end its future. Alliances shifted, marriages were arranged in desperation, and daughters were hidden away in convents to protect them from being swallowed by the Ottoman system. Yet the fear never truly faded. Every campaign, every siege carried with it the threat of another princess vanishing into the empire's machinery. For the women themselves, the legacy was silence. Death might have preserved their dignity, but survival meant participating in the dismantling of their own heritage. Many became loyal mothers, devoted wives, influential figures in the Ottoman court, but only by abandoning everything they once were. In this sense, their suffering did not end with captivity. It lived on in the choices they were forced to make, in the children they raised to conquer lands that had once belonged to their fathers, in the prayers they whispered in secret that no one would ever hear. The tragedy of these royal daughters lies in their invisibility. History remembers battles, treaties, and kings, but rarely the women who bore the weight of conquest in their very flesh. Their stories are scattered in archives, in tombstones etched with names they did not choose, haunting the narrative of power with the reminder that every empire is built not only on battles won, but on identities stolen. For them, death would have been an ending. Instead, they were condemned to live as shadows of themselves, silent legacies carried forward in blood and bone, but never in name.